All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Rosenberger, and I am the Executive Director of AMSA. And I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar entitled Reflections on Belonging, Relationships and Responsibilities in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh lands. I would like to acknowledge that the AMSA offices are on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and we acknowledge the privilege that we have on being on this territory. I'd also like to acknowledge that I live on the territory of the Semiahmoo First Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the privilege that I have on being able to live on their lands. So we're going to go through our typical housekeeping stages. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this webinar is possible due to the financial support of the Government of British Columbia Multiculturalism Grant through the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture. I'm really excited to introduce Kamala Todd. Kamala Todd is a cultural planner who will share her experience as a Metis-Cree living and working in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh Nations, and how to observe protocols in a territory to that different than her ancestors. Kamala continues to work to decolonize the city and to remind all of us, guests, residents, visitors, that we walk on Indigenous lands wherever we stand in North America. So Kamala, we're going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
We can. Hopefully. Did you want to turn on your webcam?
Okay, there we go.
There you are. So,
thank you. So I want to just start by talking a little bit about myself and tell a little story because it kind of explains why I do the work that I do. And thank you very much. I always consider it a privilege to be able to share these stories or talk about myself and my work and my thoughts. So I'm very grateful. And I'm speaking to you today from Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, where I live with my family. And here where I am, it's the unceded territories of the Squamish people, Squamish Nation as some people know, and the Shishal people, also known as Seashell people. So myself, I was born and raised all over Vancouver, Lower Mainland, grew up in various suburbs and even as far out as Hope and Stelo territories. But I'm not of these lands. So as you said in the intro, my own ancestors are Cree Métis and Eastern European. My dad is first generation Canadian of German immigrants. So I have grown up here. I identify as an Indigenous person, but these aren't my lands. My ancestors aren't here. And so my whole experience has been a process of learning what that means and learning to deepen my relationship to these lands. And so now, you know, everywhere I go, I definitely work to acknowledge whose lands I'm on, but I'm still learning what that even means and what that means for myself and for my children and for how I walk these lands. So I do also acknowledge that where I was born and where I work now in Vancouver is the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh people, as well as other nations throughout the various suburbs that we now know as the Metro Vancouver area. And so when I think about what that means, you know, a lot of times there's a fear of this kind of acknowledgement becoming just a token. You know, you say it and you move on with your business. You say it because we're supposed to, or you say it because, you know, it's nice to acknowledge. But how deep does that acknowledgement go? And how is that reflected in our own work, in our own relationships, in how we live our everyday lives, and in how we cultivate a sense of home and how we create roots in a place, whether it's new to us, whether we were born here. I think of myself usually as a guest, but I've also realized that there's that whole assumption about being invited, and I wasn't invited. My mom moved out here from Edmonton as a teenager, and so I was born here. So sometimes I can call myself an uninvited guest or a visitor or even a settler. Because, you know, it's very important to avoid the whole pan-indigeneity, and that's something I'm going to talk about today. But my process of learning and understanding what it means to live on someone else's lands has really probably only gotten stronger in the last 20 years. Growing up in Vancouver, I was very much immersed in an Indigenous world or an Indian, Aboriginal, Native world, because my mother has always been really active in the Native community. And so I grew up hanging out at the Friendship Center, which used to be called the Indian Center. I was at lots of gatherings and rallies and powwows. And so definitely had that strong sense of being part of that and knowing, who I am. But I didn't know the specificity of being on someone else's land, the specificity of the people, what their names are, what their language is, what their history is. Those things didn't come until later. Even though I grew up spending lots of time with people from the local nations, I didn't have the words. I didn't have that understanding. And I would actually say that a lot of people in the wider society, even urban Indigenous people like myself and my mother, didn't have that understanding. So really, for me, the turning point was I started to do a video after grad school. My background is in urban geography, and then I kind of migrated towards film because my mom is a filmmaker. And she mentored me on a video project with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, who we used to know as the Burrard Indian Band. So learning how to say Tsleil-Waututh was the first, okay, so this is their name, this is in their language, was a first turning point. And then to spend time with people there talking about what we were calling their urban treaty, this idea that they're doing land claims in a city. And what does that mean? What does it mean when you have almost no, when the land is so occupied and so urbanized? And so working with the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, I recognized and learned that their traditional territory is huge compared to the small, tiny reserve that they have been allocated or that they were placed on against their will. And so the traditional territory of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation includes the city of Vancouver, Burnaby, Port Coquitlam, all around the so-called Burrard Inlet and all the way up onto the Garibaldi Highlands and all through the mountains. And so their whole approach was never to be, well, we're going to settle what land claims and get back what we can of lands that haven't been urbanized and developed and occupied. And then for the rest of the lands that we've lost, we'll just take compensation, which was a traditional model, which also means giving up title to those lands. Once you settle, it's like, okay, this is what you got. Everything else, you just give up title. Well, of course, you can't give up title. Indigenous people will always retain rights and title to their lands. That's just a fact. It's just the way it is. And so the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations approach was and is to look at all the jurisdictions that are on their territories and work towards continuing to have a say, continuing to have a role and a presence and a relationship with their lands. And part of that would be what they call the variable interest model, which is forming partnerships and co-management agreements and other kinds of relationships with all the jurisdictions on their territory. So whether it be a city or BC Hydro or a district, the province, that was what they're working towards. And the really big driving theme of that approach has always been to put the face of the Tsleil-Waututh people back onto the map of the traditional territory. And so hearing that and learning that was a huge shift for me in understanding that no matter how urbanized, no matter how settled and occupied and taken away from the people, those lands will always be their lands. And so wherever I go, I am on the traditional territories of the people who have lived and traveled and been in relationship with and stewarded and been nurtured by for thousands and thousands of years. And to start to understand that and the depths of that definitely changed how I started looking at the city. because it's very easy to think about the city as just a non-native place. It's just a place. It's just a neutral, concrete, patch of civilization that's been carved out of the wilderness. And if anything is a native place, well, that would be on the reserve or maybe out in the wilderness. But to make that shift, to know that, first of all, it's a very recent incursion onto the lands, but also that it's all of it. Used to be forests and swamps and rivers and hunting grounds and burial grounds and all the cultural landscapes of the people. And so that started a process for me of starting to understand the depths of history and the depths of continuity of the people who have always lived here and who are descended from thousands of years of continuity, and to start to learn the stories, that would tell me that, for example, the mountains are the relatives, that, as part of all of the various origin stories and part of the understanding of the relationship to the land, those landforms, those places have stories. And in many cases, they are relatives who are transformed into rock, for example. And to understand and appreciate what it means to be related to the land is a pretty profound understanding. And so I'm starting to learn that, and then looking at the stories of Vancouver, growing up in Vancouver and reading everything I could get my hands on about, okay, so if this is the story of these lands, surely that's expressed somewhere, and surely people know this. But of course, that's not the case. So I've spent years reading all the history books that I could find, all the tourism guides, looking at all the various websites that talk about Vancouver and its story and its history. And likewise with BC and Canada as well, just to look at how those stories are told. But in the focus on Vancouver, it's very much a colonial tale, and it's very much a story that reflects the colonial concept of terra nullius, this idea that the lands weren't occupied, the lands didn't belong to anybody, or they weren't being used, so they were free for the taking. And that lie and that mythology of empty land is very much embedded into Vancouver's narrative. It's embedded into the way that the city was built. It's embedded into the stories that say, literally, that this was an empty land or this was nothing but wilderness. If there's any acknowledgement of the first people, it's usually just a generic First Nations or Indians, depending when the book was written, but no recognition of what happened to the people, who are they, where are they now, and what were the consequences of building this city. And so I began to be acutely aware of just how the people of these lands have been written out of the story of their lands. They've been written out of the new, place that's been imposed onto their lands, which is another strategy. If you're wanting to claim somebody else's lands as your own, you have to, first of all, not recognize that they have any rights or title to those lands, and then actively exclude them, which is the reserve system and even the pass system, where people were subject to curfew and had to get permission to leave the reserve. Not to mention the impacts of smallpox and other diseases, which hugely affected the populations, which happened right here in this area. A lot of people think of that as being elsewhere, but it happened here as well. And the residential schools and all the various colonial strategies of removing people from their lands and then creating landscapes that prohibited their participation through law, that excluded people from being part of this new society being imposed onto their lands, that created laws specifically designed to disempower people, specifically designed to exclude. So knowing that, and my knowledge is so limited and so shallow in terms of what actually has happened in Vancouver, but I've been devoting many years to learning as much as I can. You know, the frustration of going, okay, so I look around me and I see, who do I see commemorated, and what values are written into this landscape? These are values that say streams aren't important. We don't need those streams that provide food, that are habitat and ecosystems for a diversity of lives. Marshes aren't important. We need to fill those in. We need to build over those. We need to put them underground. We need to level things. You know, values that say that this is free for the taking, cultural values that say that the land and resources are just resources for extraction, for profit, and, you know, the dollar signs in people's eyes. Right now, as I'm talking to you, it's a very emotional day because I don't know if you can hear it, but the chainsaws are going. And just up the hill from us is this place that's now called Gospel Rock, but it has a Squamish name, which I don't know the name, and apparently relates to their origin story. And it's a place where, for example, Squamish councillor Halsalem Rivers, his name comes from there, I just learned. And it's a beloved area for locals because it's a lookout. And apparently it was a lookout for the Squamish Nation to look out into the sea and see if anybody was coming into their waters. Very sacred site. It's a unique ecosystem of arbutus trees, and it's very dry compared to the rainforest around us. And because of this whole colonial history and this mindset of like, well, you can buy up property and you can develop it, and you know, if you own it, then that's your right, and you just get permission from the town. There's now a developer up there chainsawing down the trees, and we can hear them being cut. We can hear them thundering to the ground, and it's heartbreaking. And I don't think I'll ever go up there again because of this. So it's all part of that same foreign value system that was brought here, and that established our cities, established our legal systems, established all the provincial, territorial, federal, municipal governments that we're all subject to, and legal systems. This mindset that we don't have any obligations to the land, we don't have any obligations to the other beings, to the ancestors, to the future generations. This mindset that says there weren't any pre-existing laws here to follow, or any pre-existing cultural knowledge, or governance systems that we need to respect. And so, of course, that's not the case. And the pain of seeing that continually happen, I can't even imagine what it's like for the people whose lands these are, to be constantly under siege. And so as I witness all of this, and as I continue to try to learn, what are the laws of these lands? How are we supposed to live here? You know, and how did it come to be that people could come in and say, oh, no, you know, we don't need any of that. You have no rights to this. We're not in any way related to these lands, and we're just going to strip them and build streets and roads and so on. So how did it come to be that that's a system that we're now in, and people have forgotten about our responsibilities, and people have been ignoring the laws of these lands for 130, 40, 50 years here in this area. And so my own teachings, you know, as much as I've been separated from my own homelands, my own language, my own cultural teachings, growing up here in Coast Salish territories, I still have the core of my cultural teachings. And one of the core teachings is reciprocity and responsibility. And so I recognize that by me living here, I have contributed to the impacts and the losses that the people of these lands have experienced. I have enjoyed the beauty and privilege and abundance of these lands, while the people of these lands, you know, have limited access to their lands and resources. They have had their access to their their traditional foods and clean waters and sacred sites and everything curtailed by urbanization and by all the different imposed systems of law. And so for me, I take those teachings of reciprocity and responsibility, and I do whatever I can to challenge those colonial narratives, to denormalize, to somehow challenge this sort of normalized system that says this is the way it's always been, this is normal and healthy and progressive, and we have a good system of law, and this is how we live. I challenge that because of what I have learned about how, even the system that I work at in the city of Vancouver, that whole system is an imposed system of law. And the way that the city was acquired and the way that the wealth was acquired to build everything was ill acquired. It was stolen. And so that's the foundation of the society that I live in, that I work in. And what do you do with that? And how do you still build a home and a sense of belonging and a sense of connection and roots on someone else's lands when you know that that's how this place was created? And when you know that the people of these lands continue to live pushed to the margins on small reserves with busy, high traffic roads going through them, with limited access to their traditional foods and lands and governance systems, with their laws not being respected. All of those things that come with living somewhere that has this colonial past and present. And so as a filmmaker and as a community planner, I just do what I can to listen to those stories, and then to either facilitate those stories being shared for other people to hear and listen and learn from that, or to challenge the colonial narratives and to challenge the colonial assumptions about what this place is, what the story is, what the history is, and who are the caretakers. Because in creating the city of Vancouver, the white Anglo male settlers appointed themselves the caretakers. They appointed themselves the founders. And so, you go into City Hall and you look at the wall of the mayors and who have been at the helm of shaping the city or making decisions about the city, and it's all white men. And that hasn't changed yet. And so it's looking at, how can we challenge that, and how can we make that, as I said, denormalize, or whatever the word is for, or denaturalize that current state of affairs. So I've been working for the city of Vancouver, trying to do that in various ways, mostly through stories and helping people to understand that there's a lot more going on here than what we see on the surface. Helping people to recognize the importance of building relationships with the people of these lands and understanding our place here and our own responsibilities here. Helping to build circles of dialogue, as I worked with the Dialogues Project with Baldwin, and the learning and sharing that happened with that was phenomenal. Doing film that is all devoted to people from these lands sharing their stories, speaking their languages, being heard, being seen, being, once again on their land and speaking about their lands. I go to meetings with planners who say, okay, so what's the story of this neighborhood, and what are the considerations we need to have for this neighborhood? And the city's approach is always to fund a consultant to do a historical context statement or a statement of significance for a certain neighborhood before a neighborhood plan happens. And most often, the consultant who's hired to do that and tell that story is a white male. And the story that those consultants tend to tell are, very shallow, very recent, and the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh Nations are really not woven throughout those stories in any meaningful way. If there's any acknowledgement at all, it's maybe at the beginning or in the heritage section or in a certain section, but there isn't that fundamental recognition that the people have always been here, that they're still here, and that the city of Vancouver, the history and building the city of Vancouver has had serious impacts and consequences on their lands and waters and everyday lives. Not to mention all the various legal impositions on people around being able to practice their culture, speak their language, perform their various systems of governance, such as potlatching as an example. And so I'm pushing in my own way, in my own small way at City Hall to say, why are we continuing to pay white men to tell those stories and to tell those stories that reinforce this myth of empty land, that reinforce this idea that these places were founded by white men and that's the main or dominant or host culture of Vancouver, which means other communities that have also been here since the time of first settlers, just as long, and are also not acknowledged in a lot of those histories. So those are some of the ways that I'm trying to address. And then also it's all about, the amazing, and I mean it's amazing, city of Vancouver formally acknowledging that it is on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh people. When that happened in 2014, it was beyond anything I could ever dream would have happened in my lifetime. Because when I was working for the city back in 2000, there was no recognition or awareness or relationship with the local nations. So if we have that incredible historic recognition of Vancouver as being on the unceded lands, how are we reflecting that in our governance? And how is that reflected on the land itself? How is that reflected in the stories of Vancouver and people's understanding of this place? Because, as I said, I've read everything I can get my hands on, and invariably it's things like this. Douglas Copeland's piece of garbage book called City of Glass that talks about, all the cutesy things and has no real depth of understanding about what the land is and who the people are and what the languages are. But that image of the city as this sort of glossy, beautiful place, which it is, but how deep does that narrative go, and how inclusive is that narrative? And does that narrative celebrate the making of this place, or is it honest about the violence that was inflicted in the making of Vancouver, the violence that's being inflicted right now up the road from me as all of these habitats are being cut down to make way for condos? It's an ongoing struggle, and as I said, as part of my teachings, I'm doing whatever I can to undo some of that damage or contribute to the healing that needs to happen. So that's my little spiel. I have a video that I thought I could share as an example of how I try to elevate the voices of the people of these lands who have taught me so much, who are so generous and so patient. And so I could show that, and then we could have some conversation, and I could talk more about some of the stuff that's going on at the city, if that's of interest, or whatever is of interest for people. But if we could just show the wrapped video right now, that would be great.
Así saya Musqueam, tenente from Musqueam. Tla kusenasiwanet kepalano y fulsimulto. Kushilokster de Huinas imignaten, kushwe de saas tamuket from Musqueam. Sequence theatala y hiloksa set to something neat as well as theatala heitka. When people had asked and spoke about the Aboriginal people coming over the land bridge, our old people have said, we have been here forever. We have no stories that bring us over land or across the water or any other means of being here. We have always been here.
Our people have been here since time out of mind. We are not going anywhere. We need to find a way to work together. We need the city to understand who the Coast Salish people are.
We are an ancient people. We're not a new city. We're not a new celebrating 150 years. We're celebrating 10,000 years.
Tseil-Waututh were people of the inlet. Our ancestors used to say when the tide was out, the table was set. All our food came from the water. Pretty well everything is gone.
I'm really trying in my life to strive to be a true Stamol Slanai, true woman of the Squamish people. And that is to be humble, and that is to accept what my role is.
We've always been taught to respect Mother Earth and to take care of her.
The rocks are our grandfathers, and the plants are our grandmothers. We're actually talking to our ancestors. And you wouldn't just walk into your grandmother's house and just take whatever you want and walk out.
Some of us want to maintain the responsibility for the earth, for life. We don't want everything technical. We want to be who we are. How can anybody reconnect themselves when they're taking away all of our places that are sacred to us and saying it's not important anymore?
A lot of us who aren't from here don't have that sense of Indigenous laws that are here and that sense of our obligations and responsibilities. And so I just want to make sure we don't also overwrite in our learning about the land and becoming connected to the land, that we are always completely aware of where we're standing and whose ancestors have always been here and what people have lost and what people have had to give up.
Iwo ya ni yasistam se samo. Because iwo ya iwo he ni sweet enough to eat to tamakut from Musqueam. That we've always been here. We've been here for a long, long time.
Thank you. So that's just one example taken from.
Kamala, sorry, it's Katie. I'm just going to interrupt you really quickly. We did receive several comments during the video that there was audio malfunctionings for people. Kamala, were you able to hear it?
I was, yeah.
Okay, good. So not all audio drivers are compatible with GoToWebinar. So we realized that for some folks, they weren't able to hear the video. It looks like the majority of people did. We have 75 lines connected and we only heard from 2 or 3 people, I think. But we will be sending the links to the videos out afterwards. And so they are beautiful and we strongly recommend that people have that opportunity. But yeah, we're also getting comments right now. Amazing video. I was able to hear. This video is incredible. So it was definitely a mixed bag. It just seems to depend on people's audio drivers and their compatibility.
Okay.
So that tech piece over. All right, we'll hand it back to you, Kamala.
Yeah, and so much of that is audio based, so I'm sorry you weren't able to hear. For those who didn't, I will send you the link. And on my Vimeo page is a whole bunch of videos as well. And that one is compiled from several video projects or audio projects that I've been part of. Again, Larry Grant talks about, as Musqueam people, how they've always been here, and every chance I get, I try to reinforce that. So yeah, I can keep talking about that, but I'm also open to, if there's a certain area that people want to discuss, happy to talk about that. I think one thing that's really a big theme right now, just to emphasize one more time, is just this idea of the specificity of the lands where you live. So you might live somewhere else. It's not enough to just say, oh, the Indigenous people, or to sort of have this sort of pan-Indigenous approach, that it's the specificity of the people whose lands you're on. And so in the case of Vancouver, it's Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh. Some of the other nations of the area also came through those waters, of course, so it's not like people just stayed in one area. They all traveled, and but officially the city and the nations themselves recognize that the city of Vancouver as being on the territory of those three nations. Same with where I live here in Gibsons. It's officially recognized, although there's the town itself doesn't recognize, but it's seen as Squamish territory. But of course, the Sechelt people moved all throughout this area, so they also have a relationship to these lands. So I acknowledge both nations when I think about this place. So it's just getting away from any kind of pan-Indigenous idea, and the importance of. Yeah, and some people go even more detailed. They talk about even village sites or family names, that there's the specificity of that as well. So
Kamala, this is Javier Ojeda. I'm here with AMSA. I'm leading the project on Indigenous and newcomers relationships, and as many people here know, and I'm assuming that some of the people that are connected today are going to be on our symposium next Friday. So we're really happy that this is a great introduction, and we're so pleased to have you. So one of the things that we were discussing here as we were listening to you is that idea that you as an Indigenous person, as like self-identified Indigenous person, how you are being so careful about being in a guest land and being like you say that you were talking about how you are an uninvited guest or something like that. So and then you talked a little bit about how like trying to learn about the traditions, trying to learn about the history of the place, trying to learn about the people and the lands and all those things. So I think this is a topic that a lot of people talk about, and a lot of people are trying to get into, also as non-Indigenous and as settlers, as you were mentioning, and not only at an individual level, but also at an organizational level, right? And we have some different levels of leadership. One of the things that we discuss here in AMSA that we would like to, get your opinion on, is for non-Indigenous people, a lot of the times is we want to learn about Indigenous people, we want to learn about the history, and that's obviously a must do. But one of the questions that we have is, before doing that, like sometimes we feel like, do we need to see or take a look or reflect on like to who we are in these lands as non-Indigenous people, before or as we learn, about Indigenous people and the traditions and the values, because otherwise sometimes it feels that we might be losing a good place to be, to truly understand and to truly learn about this issue and be able to do something about it, right? So it's the question, like, it's not only about like who are Indigenous people, but it's like, who am I as a non-Indigenous person or as a settler in these unceded lands, especially when we all go with you were saying, right? Like sometimes it's just lip service, like we acknowledge that we are blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So I don't know if you have something to comment on that, and that idea of like who we are as non-Indigenous people in this land, to frame this type of work and understanding and reflection.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Because sometimes I think it, like because I'm, have Indigenous identity, sometimes I feel like, oh, well, I'm not part of the problem, or I'm one of them, like it's, but then I'm having to realize that, of course, even though my ancestors experienced the same thing that's happening here on these lands, by me being here, I am contributing to that. I'm not a colonizer in that same sense, but I'm contributing to that that history of what's happened here on these lands. So I have had to find my ways of making peace with that, and that's how I do that through my own work and through cultivating those relationships and being mindful and it's painful. Everywhere I go, I'm mindful of the fact that, oh, this is a beautiful creek that I get to walk along. I wonder how the people used to use this creek that they can no longer use. I talk to my kids when we're down at the beach, like, oh, this probably would have been, a really great fishing site or a village, like just to be constantly aware of what was lost, and that we're not at that point yet where people really appreciate and know that and understand that in a really deep way. So I think reflecting on that is really important, because I think I have come up against a lot of defensiveness, and I'm sure we all have, in terms of people saying, well, I'm a fourth generation Vancouverite. This is my home. My family built this place. This is our heritage. Vancouver is our heritage, which is true. People are part of that history and they feel proud of that history. Okay, but how far are they willing to go in acknowledging deeper histories and acknowledging the effects that and then people always say, well, it was my ancestors, so I didn't do it, so why should I have to be accountable or take any responsibility for what was done before? And again, that's up to people to make their own peace with. But the thing is, I was just actually reading a really good book by Lee Miracle. She's Tsleil and Tseil-Waututh, actually, her family. She's a granddaughter of Chief Dan George. And she's talking about how, decolonizing isn't just for Indigenous people. Decolonizing is necessary because we live in a colonial, capitalistic, racist, patriarchal society. So the onus is on all of us, if we don't want to live in a capitalistic, colonial, racist, patriarchal society, to do something about that. So yes, it impacts Indigenous people the most right now because of all the history and all the harms and the ongoing violence and the ongoing dispossession and disempowerment. But it affects everybody who lives here. So yes, you might come here and it's a beautiful home, and it is. And it's a place where you can lay down roots, and it is a place where you have a right to be. But then how do you contend with that history? If you take the time to learn some of that history, how do you contend with that? How do you make peace with that? And are you okay to just say, oh, that was in the past, and not recognize that it's still affecting people, and then figure out your own story and your own place within that? Another example of the generosity of the local people is, I think people have those who are defensive and who claim that that they built this place, or this is their home, see that as mutually exclusive. That somehow claiming this as their home means that they don't want to acknowledge that it's actually the home of and the homelands of the First Peoples. And that by acknowledging that, they're somehow saying that they don't have a right to be here, or that this isn't their home anymore. That whole nonsense that we used to hear about, like, oh, so what are you going to send me back, or what does that mean, you're going to take my house away? Yeah. And so it's about knowing where you live. It's about knowing the lands, like in every sense of that way. Like, what is this place? What is the nature of where I live? Who are the people? What is the language? And what happened to that? And why did that get lost? And what can I do to not contribute to a further erasure? What can I do to contribute to greater understanding and acknowledgement. And so I see one of the questions about how to find out more about whose territories you're on. I have to say, when I'm going to go somewhere, I actually just look it up. I just Google it, so Prince George, traditional territory. And there might be different stories of that. So then I keep looking and I look for the websites or the writings or the stories from the people themselves and how they explain their history and presence on their lands. There is a website, I think nativeland.ca. It's done by a non-Indigenous person, but he's really attempted to try to show all the traditional territories across Canada and then link to the nations themselves who are in those lands, because nowadays most nations have their own websites that talk about their place there and their history and their story. So in the case of Musqueam, Squamish and Tseil-Waututh, for example, their websites have very rich perspectives about their lands and their relationships and their histories here, where you can begin to learn some of that. Videos, books, those kinds of things. I'm always reading and quoting from different writers and people from these lands and how they talk about their relationships with their lands. So yeah, I don't think it's like I just think that understanding your place here is just as important as looking at how to contribute to decolonizing. Yeah, because we're all woven within it.
So Kamala, I'm not sure if you see on the questions panel, because we've had a few come in since, but there was a question posed by somebody earlier who said that, as a white settler themselves, how do you see the role of bearing witness in daily work, and how might that play out in the workplace? So would you be able to kind of reflect on that piece as well, on workplaces, especially given your experience with the City of Vancouver?
Sorry, can you repeat? So in your workplace?
Yeah, so how do you see the role of quote unquote bearing witness in our daily work, and how that plays out in the workplace?
I guess it's, again, the first step of the learning the nature, the story, the histories and the people and the languages of the place where you live, and to the best of your ability. And then when you're in a room and people are talking about the place as if it has no history, or people are talking about the place without the recognition that the people whose lands these are need to be part of decision making. It's all those moments where you can advocate in every way you can for consideration of that, for consideration of this as Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh lands, and what that looks like. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the witnessing part of that question refers to, other than like is it the witnessing and the learning from the first peoples, or is it the witnessing of things that you see and kind of problems in the work setting in terms of?
Yeah, I'm wondering too if the question posed was more that kind of that being a bystander, right? And how that kind of plays out in the workplace. So we'll see if the person who posed that question wanted to expand on that a little bit. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Con to just scroll all the way down to the bottom for a sec, to that bottom question that just came in, because this is interesting, and I would like to see your perspective on this one, Kamala, because it builds on what you've been talking about. But thinking about the root causes of the defensiveness of settler people and the relationship to the land they own and the homes they have on this land. Okay. We're doing a lot of work on that at AMSA right now. And I myself, as a settler and as a white woman, am working really hard to figure out how, as the executive director of AMSA, I support my organization and support my members in understanding that we all have accountability, and we have all received privilege by the settlement of this territory. And so, you know, I do find that there's a lot of defensiveness. And as we prepare to go into our symposium next Friday, I'm both excited and a little nervous about the defensiveness that I'm expecting in the room when I, you know, put people in a place where they do feel that their place and their position is challenged. What's been your experience with that?
Thanks for the question, Dorothy. It's definitely, so I feel it in my everyday life in some ways. So for example, my partner is a white man. And as I was going to say earlier to the first question, again, it's sometimes seen as this is like something for woke people or Indigenous people to take on, but everyday Canadians, you know, don't necessarily have to deal with it. So even my partner, he gets it and he understands everything that I say, but I don't know how he necessarily incorporates that into his everyday life. He still goes about his everyday life as a white man in Canada who grew up with all the comforts. My neighbors are also they're a white family, and they definitely have all of those comforts, all of those privileges of growing up here in Vancouver on the west side. And again, they hear what I'm doing, I talk about it, they agree, they get it, they understand, but in their everyday lives, there's nothing that compels them to have to really confront their own privilege. And I don't think they would ever want to. And they might be like, well, yeah, but we have our own experiences and we have our own struggles. So it is, I think, partly to answer Dorothy's question, it is partly not wanting to give up that privilege or fearing that what would that mean, you know, you know, if people are like how far are people willing to go in acknowledging not only that this is somebody else's land, but that maybe they have benefited at the expense of the people whose lands they're on, and are people willing to do that? And if so, what does that look like? And how, like, you know, what is the process to work through that and come out the other side? Because of course it's a scary, uncomfortable feeling, and people don't want to have to recognize that they have much of what they have has come from taking people's lands, taking people's wealth, and meanwhile the people themselves continuing to be relatively impoverished economically. So I think there's a hesitation for sure. I don't know. Again, it's the people, it's Indigenous people, it's the people of the lands having to bear the burden of knowing that and seeing that and living that, and then people who have all the privilege and comforts not having to. You know, they're not forced to have to face that. So it's easier not to. In another really good book, the Reconciliation Manifesto, Recovering the Land, Rebuilding the Economy by the late Arthur Manuel. He talks about, and I might, if there's time, I might read a couple things at the end about kind of steps forward. You know, but the recognition, and that I was mentioning the generosity earlier, like, you know, all the people who I know from these lands talk about, yes, this is your home. We want you to see it as your home because we want you to take good care of it. And, you know, this acceptance of like, well, you're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere, so we have to all work together. And the recognition that, yeah, it's not like kicking people out, it's looking at how we got to where we are, and how that has affected the people. So maybe I'll just read this really quickly. Canada needs to fully recognize our Aboriginal treaty rights and our absolute right to self-determination. At the same time, we will recognize the fundamental human rights of Canadians after hundreds of years of settlement to live here. Then we can sit down and negotiate a way that Canadians and Indigenous people can live on this vast shared land in a way that allows for prosperity for both societies and protects our environment for all of the generations to come. So again, a very generous perspective, but I think a big part of it is, and we hear this a lot, you know, that people don't really know the history, that if they knew the history, they would be outraged, they would want to do something. If they knew, you know, how bad the residential school system was, if they knew how bad the death from diseases was, and the violence and all the things that have been inflicted and continue to be inflicted. You like to think that when people know that then they'll be like, okay, this is the foundation of my country, and I need to do something about it. But that isn't always the case. But if we can somehow just start, it's all that truth telling stuff, right? About truth and reconciliation. If we can somehow get to the point where we're absolutely honest about the true history of what created these beautiful cities and towns that we love so much, if we're absolutely honest about that, then I think we can start to move forward. But many people resist seeing it in that way, and that's, I think, the challenge that we face right now. The whole get over it, or the whole that was in the past, or you were conquered, or we stole it fair and square, all that kind of stuff. That's the main obstacle I find right now in these conversations.
Thank you, Kamala, for that. I don't know if you can see that in the question box, it's like exploding right now, which is really awesome that people are so engaged and asking a lot of questions. And then it also looks like we have some people who are contributing great thoughts and ideas as well. So, I know Dorothy Christensen, thank you for your activity in the question box there. And we're going to try to get to everything as much as we can, but I do want to make sure that Kamala's getting the opportunity to respond to everybody. Kamala, I really, this is an AMSA webinar, and so, I really want to make sure that the issues that we're hearing about come forward. And there's been one question that says, do you have any tips on how, although having good intentions, you won't blindly stumble into being disrespectful to Indigenous people you encounter? I know this is something that we hear a lot, where people want, they want to move forward and they want to have a relationship or make a connection, but they're scared of stumbling into being disrespectful. Do you have any advice on that?
Sorry if I can jump in just for a second also, because I think that's one of the sides of that question. I think the other thing that we've been hearing also, and that also I've experienced in past work, is that idea of, the good intentions, and, we have some like, oh, but I did it with my best intention, but then we don't realize that actually the impacts might not be as good as, as well intended. So that idea of just because you have good intentions, that's, sometimes might lead to some negative impact. So how do you?
Right. And the first part again, Katie, was about people. Can you summarize one more time?
Yeah,
people being scared. Right?
Yeah, people being nervous or kind of withdrawing rather than going out there and so that they don't stumble into that disrespectful, the place where there could be disrespect shown inadvertently.
Yeah. So I guess in a workplace, as an example, that's where having cultural competency training is one step. Having direct involvement and voice and inclusion of the people themselves is a way, so it's like the more relationships you have, then those things won't happen because you're not, speaking about people or speaking for people, you're speaking with people, and you're working to to share space, to share decision making, to share visioning for a future together. So I think relationships are a really big part of it. And I think, it's definitely, it comes up a lot in terms of protocols and how to do things. And again, I think that's where the listening really comes in, just creating space for people themselves to come in and talk about what they need, what they want, how they want to be involved. And of course, if in this case of actually bringing people in, you pay them all the time, make sure you can support them with transportation and those kinds of things. But I think the main thing right now is like that listening, that humility, and you know, there's gazillions of examples of people out there speaking about what the issues are, speaking about what they want from Canadians, what they want from settlers, what needs to happen. And so there's not really any reason to not have that knowledge or to hear directly from people themselves, because people themselves have been saying it for generations, and now much of that is documented and shared and available everywhere online. So in terms of that learning, there's a lot of information out there, and so it's just a matter of starting to do that. And then I guess the other thing is to not presume that you're the one who's going to make those changes or has to make those changes, but that you know, in every chance we get, to just again try to make space for people themselves to talk about what the issues are for them, what the needs are, you know, how your organization can change, whether it's even relevant. You know, there's a lot of times that I'll be at the city and we'll be like, oh yeah, this project, well, we better reach out to the nations, or we better, you know, create this opportunity. And then there's also this thing of like, if they want, you know, people might be like, well, that project, you know, in the scheme of things, it's not really a priority right now. So there's also that, which comes from dialogue and really hearing from people about what their immediate needs are. But I'm not an expert either on this kind of stuff in terms of how to direct people to be allies. There's lots of different opinions out there about that, and that's another thing you can look up, is the idea about, you know, some people saying you don't get to call yourself an ally. You have to be named an ally, and yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kamala. Before we keep going, because there's a lot of questions coming up in the question box, and I do want to point out that we've got about 25 minutes left before we have to say goodbye for today. There has been a comment about not being quite sure about the question piece. So I did read that off in the beginning about how questions and answers are going to go. So I just want to go back and make sure, because I don't want anybody on the line to be confused about that part or not feel like they're able to submit their questions. So I had Con put the PowerPoint slide back up that says about submitting questions and about how questions can go into the question box, or they can be emailed to events@amsa.org. And then, you know, obviously people are seeing that question box there, so that's great. We have had some questions come through on email as well, so Melissa has been adding those questions in. And then I also did mention that Kamala had access to the questions and could see the question box, or that Javier and I would be in the discussion trying to bring some of the questions into the discussion. So, you know, we obviously can't bring every question or comment in. There's a lot in there, but I did want to make sure that everybody feels that they are able to ask any questions that they may have, and that we will continue to use this method, and hopefully everybody gets in what they need to get in. So I will pass it back over to you, Kamala. I'm not sure if there's a question that stands out for you in the question box, or if there's any that you would like us to identify.
Oh, there's pretty big questions here.
There are, aren't there?
Yeah. I guess just wanting to reiterate again, like when people say where to start, you know, it is an information age. There's so much out there from people who have been writing and talking about this forever. So the examples that I gave, my Conversations with Canadians by Lee Miracle, a very recent, great example, where she just tells it like it is, and she's from this area. The Reconciliation Manifesto by Arthur Manuel, but you know, those are just two examples that I was drawing from today. But again, there's so much out there, and there's so many brilliant people doing really good work as filmmakers, as writers, as speakers, as academics. Dorothy Christian here on the list has definitely taught me a lot. You know, I don't want to be disrespectful, but there really isn't an excuse for not knowing where to start or not knowing how to access the resources because they're all there, and it's just a matter of doing that work. I'm constantly trying to read and learn, and you know, in the case of Vancouver, I just look up, you know, Vancouver unceded territories or Vancouver colonization, and there's so many papers or videos or different things that are out there to bring more to my learning. So I encourage people to just get steeped in that learning. And there's also quite a bit of cultural competency training out there. The nations themselves have great videos that explain a bit about who they are. They have, you know, their own approaches to community planning. They have declarations that talk about their own histories and relationships on their lands, those kinds of things. It's really important to learn what the language of the lands you're on. In the case of Vancouver, it's Squamish and Hunkaminam. The two languages are the main languages of the area. Yeah, let's see. If you guys, yeah. I'm happy. I don't know if this continues after, if I can respond to people through this after, because
that's what I'm wondering. Or you know what, even Kamala, if you would be open to us just sending you all of the questions, and then if you want to kind of reflect, and then we can send that out to the participants, that's another option as well. Because like we said, there's some really, really big questions in here.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we want to make sure that we're doing them justice.
Yeah. See here. Yeah, I mean, I guess, okay, how about I read some of this about the reconciliation steps here, because I think it's helpful. So the one thing that Arthur Manuel always emphasized, I think is really important for people, you know, talking about information, is the fact that First Indigenous people in Canada, whether that be First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, out of all the land base in Canada, Indigenous people only control 0.2%, whether that be reserve lands, which they don't officially or technically own, not legally recognized as owning, but maybe have some jurisdiction over, or whether that be, you know, fee simple that nations have bought, which has been happening here in the Vancouver area. But 0.2% of all the land base in Canada. In the case of British Columbia, it's 0.36%. So going from having 100% use and access and control and jurisdiction over your lands to that is what Arthur Manuel talks about as the explanation for the ongoing impoverishment, the ongoing inequality and injustice that Indigenous people face. So those are the kinds of things that you can learn, that you can share, that you can try to address, is that you live in a country that has that kind of status quo. The boil water advisories, you know, how many, you know, 150, last time I looked, communities where they can't drink their tap water, they don't have clean tap water, and the ongoing high levels of incarceration, you know, all the statistics, the ongoing violence against Indigenous women and girls, all of that information is there. And what do we do with that? If you live in a country that is wonderful and welcoming and beautiful, but also has that going on, how do you make peace with that? And how do you walk on these lands with that knowledge? So some of the steps that Arthur Manuel talks about, he has a chapter called the 6-Step Program to Decolonization. I'm just going to read a couple, but the first one he says is to formally denounce the racist doctrine of discovery and terra nullius as justification for settler presence on our lands, as well as any other doctrines, laws, or policies that would allow you to address us on any other basis than nation to nation. So the need to get past this idea that there was nothing here, and that, you know, the way that Canada was established is fine. It's, you know, the pioneer tales that are celebrated all the time that I find, you know, highly problematic. and the recognition of self-determined sovereign nations. Number 2, as part of the nation-to-nation negotiation, you must logically recognize our right to self-determination, which is the essential decolonizing remedy to move Indigenous people from dependency to freedom. And then number 3, acknowledgement of our right to self-determination must be according to international human rights standards and include ecological and equitable development principles, Indigenous knowledge systems, laws, relationships to land, worldviews, technologies, innovations, and practices, and of course, recognition and affirmation of our Aboriginal title and rights to the lands that the Creator has given each nation in which we have inhabited since time immemorial. And then I think I had already read a bit that said this, but this one, number 4, I would like, because it's about coming together and working towards reconciliation. At this point, we can finally sit down together for the long grown-up talk about who we are and what we need, and who you are and what you need, and we can then begin to sort out the complicated questions about access to our lands and sharing the benefits. These talks can indeed lead to reconciliation, but only after our rights as title holders and decision makers on the land and our economic and cultural needs are met. We, in turn, will ensure that your very real human right to be here after 400 years is respected and your economic and cultural needs are also met. So some of the basics, which again, we don't even have this. So that's why the ongoing need. And that's also why the frustration a lot of people have with the term reconciliation, as if it's just a matter of sorting things out, you know, like a family might do. It's a little bit more than that.
Thank you for that. One of the pieces that we are going to be talking about when we have our symposium next week, and you know, AMSA as the umbrella organization for immigrant settlement organizations here in BC, we're looking at how do we come from a place where we're inviting migration to unceded territory. And so as the umbrella organization, we want to make sure that we can communicate with our membership and we can communicate with our other stakeholders what it means to invite migration and migrants to unceded territories when we're here as settlers ourselves. Can you shed any light or thoughts on that?
Well, it's that whole idea of, again, it's if, as even Arthur was recognizing, you know, if you have a history of being here, it's your home. Everybody that I've talked to is very welcoming in that sense of, yes, it's your home. But it's how it's done. Is it done as we are the host nation, the host culture, or is it done in like, you know, welcome to these unceded lands, like that deeper recognition, and that deeper recognition that's not just in name and not sort of speaking about the people, but actually working towards, you know, that ongoing visibility of the people. So at my job at the city right now, visibility and voice on the land, as I mentioned at the very beginning about Tsleil-Waututh's objective of putting their face back onto the map of their traditional territory, how important that visibility is, not just in a superficial way, but in the sense of this place being deeply, undeniably, visibly, widely known as Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh lands, and the same for all territories across this country. So there wouldn't be that kind of dilemma or question about where you're inviting people to and how and your place in inviting people to these lands, if that was the case. So when we get to that point, we wouldn't have as much of that kind of tension. I think I had a question about that a little while ago. Somebody saying like, you know, when I take visitors out and we do little tours and I'm like really proud of where I live, and you know, is that like, what do I do with that? And of course, I mean, I feel that too, like this is a beautiful place, but I'm always saying this is a beautiful Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh place, or, you know, having that be part of the identity at all times, having that be known, and doing what I can to help that be known, because that's where it becomes an issue, where people present this place without that context, without that fact, without that identity of being a Musqueam, Squamish, and Tseil-Waututh place. So just be mindful of not further contributing to any erasure. Be mindful of repopulating. You know, the history of colonialism depopulated these lands. It saw them as empty places for extraction and profit, and you know, writing themselves onto the settlers, writing themselves onto the land and making it in their image. And so to counter that, it's about repopulating, you know, helping to reinscribe those languages, those histories, as something to be celebrated, to be proud of, to be part of. You know, I was told by a Musqueam leader, Wendy John, that Musqueam stories are everybody's stories. Now, she didn't mean that people can go and take what they want from Musqueam stories, and there are definitely stories that are not for public consumption. But the idea that if you live here, then you are living on a place that has thousands of years of stories, has thousands of years of cultural continuity, and you need to know that, and you need to connect to that, and figure out how you can be respectful and mindful of that in every way. So, you know, it's things like when people become Canadian citizens and they have to, you know, I don't know the whole procedure, but there's the Queen, and there's, you know, that whole narrative has to be rewritten. That whole narrative of who founded this place, who are the caretakers, who are the kind of the host culture, you know, that the whole narrative of migration. I was in the geography department when they started the Metropolis project, and it was all about, you know, let's look at the changing demographics and how this influx of new migrants is changing the look and feel of Vancouver. And, you know, this idea that the default or the origin or the host culture was white Anglo culture is false, and we need to move past that, and we need to start decolonizing those narratives.
Thanks, Kamala. There's another question in there, and the questions are quite beefy, for lack of a better term. They're robust. So I want to try to find a way to kind of reframe this question. And I'm just going to get Con to go back up to that one that we were just on. Yeah, that one right there at the bottom there. So it's talking about relationship building and building relationships so we're not using tokenism. And, you know, and that is something that I think this person is reflecting on it happening in their experience, because people want to, you know, oh, I want to be friendly with somebody from this country or somebody who looks this way, and so I'm going to, you know, solicit a relationship with them. And so really what the question is talking about is recommendations for building relationships for with Indigenous people to build that knowledge base that doesn't come across as kind of tokenistic.
Mm-hmm. There's probably others who could answer this much better, but I think okay, so some of the things that have been done, and I mean, I think for a lot of people, this is not always comfortable, because it is like, you know, people don't necessarily want to leave their community. They'd like to kind of focus in on their own families and their own community. But there's a need, as a city has cropped up on their lands, obviously to engage and to build relationships. So there's a lot of people from the local nations who are very active in the community, very outgoing in terms of sharing and helping others to understand. You know, the whole point of territorial acknowledgements or protocol or welcomes is and why people keep doing it, even though it, you know, they have to travel so far, and sometimes it's only 5-10 minutes to do their welcome, and then they leave, which could be argued as sometimes tokenistic. But the reason why from my understanding, why people do it is because they want people to know, they want people to see who the people are, to really feel that connection. I have been told by people from the local nations, you know, come on down to our events. You know, Squamish Nation has powwows in the summer. Tsleil-Waututh sometimes will have a cultural festival at Waiawachin Kate's Park. Musqueam has Aboriginal Days or Indigenous Peoples Days events. They have a cultural center there that's open to the public. There's different ways where that relationship is invited, where people are saying, you know, come along, and you know, at talks or exhibits where people from the nations are there. And it's not about, you know, can I be your friend? It's about, and maybe that can develop, but it's about just engaging and listening to the people of the lands and what they have to share. In terms of Indigenous people in general as well, the Friendship Center has all kinds of cultural events that are often open to the public, like the powwow nights and West Coast nights, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, or just keep an eye on different events that are going on there. And there's all kinds of different talks and events that go in the city. So to me, it's more about just the listening and the learning and seeing what's going on and how people want to share who they are, and not necessarily needing to, you know, be friends with people as part of that relationship building. To me, it's more of a relationship building of understanding how they talk about this place and understanding their relationship to these lands, and how that affects how we understand the land. If you're not from here, for me, it's how I understand these lands from hearing from them, from their stories, from their perspectives. And then, you know, maybe I will invite somebody in to come and do a talk, or to do an acknowledgement, or to be part of a project. I mean, I have strong and active relationships with people from the nations because it's this is how I live my life and do my work, but that definitely took time. And it's all based upon constantly providing opportunities for people to share their self-determined voice and story and culture as they want to, and with who they want to. So, you know, if you're with an organization that has the means to do that, you know, you might find that people are interested. They are interested in coming to talk to people about what they want them to know about their lands, or what they want them to know about their culture, or their art forms, or their language, and so on. So, but I think just being present, and again, being humble and not having those expectations, and just being in those spaces where you can listen can go a long way. There are there's cultural tourisms, right? Like Takaya Tours from Tsleil-Waututh Nation, they bring people out, they invite them and take them out on the water and tell stories and share songs. You know, there's more and more of those kinds of things out there where you are literally welcomed in to connect with people.
Thank you. So I think we are close to wrapping up, but I would like to ask you some closing question, as you know, as a filmmaker and storyteller, right? Because you know this is a lot about storytelling, and you were saying I really like I mean I liked almost everything you said, but there was this one thing that resonated with me when you say, like, why are we still paying white men to tell the story of this place and perpetuate the lie, right, of that empty land. So my question, you know, a bit of a final thought of reflection would be like, how do we start changing who tells the story of these lands?
Thank you for that question. So so part of the reason why I do the films that I do is to kind of is to bring those stories out, to counter those those erasures or to counter the kind of dominant colonial narrative. And I've done what I can in that way. I've done a lot of video projects and oral history projects where those stories have been shared and they transform people's understanding. For example, the Great Fire. And I mean, I just read the heritage document that the city had made a few years ago, and they talk about the Great Fire, but they don't mention that Squamish Nation people rescued the settlers from the Great Fire when they saw the flames, and they canoed across the water and rescued them. That's not part of the narrative of Vancouver, and yet that's a huge example of, you know, the relationships and the generosity of the people of these lands. So bringing out for myself, I listen to those stories when I hear them, and then if they're to be shared, then finding ways to share them. But specifically to address those colonial documents and the ongoing tendency of the city to say, oh, well, we need a consultant, and there's a go-to person who pretty much gets all of those contracts, and the work that they produce is problematic in my view. What I'm advocating for is to say, okay, so if we're going to do historical context statement or statement of significance for this neighborhood, so for example, the Broadway plan that's happening right now, some of that money that would normally go to a consultant who would then go and maybe extract a little bit of information from the nations, maybe include a few sentences. Instead, we need to carve off some of that money and give it directly to the nations, and so that they can each do their own statement of significance of that area, so that their voice is directly heard, directly included, and is taken into account in planning decisions. Because the consequences of not having their voices in there are huge, and it's the focus of my work right now, is that ongoing exclusion of direct voice of the nations in talking about this place, and specifically in planning decisions. So film and storytelling and all that can help, but it's also decolonizing the process within the city itself and how that happens. So I'm pushing for that right now.
Kamala, we literally are right at 1:30. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, I thank you so much. Thank you for first of all responding to us when we put out the request to have you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your stories. Thank you for going on the webcam and, you know, putting yourself out there for all the participants to be able to see your face. You have a beautiful, expressive face, and it was such a treat to be able to actually see you speak. So thank you so much for that. We will be sharing the webinar recording on the AMSA website, and we'll send a notification to all registrants. We'll go back and take a look at some of these questions and see if there's any that we can pull some answers together for. We're also going to share the registration link to all the webinar participants for the online video stream of the symposium we're doing on April 5th, the Indigenous Newcomer Relationship Symposium, an organizational dialogue on unsettling practices. It will be live streamed, so people can watch it in real time next Friday, April the 5th. I also would like to thank the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture's Multiculturalism Grant for funding the webinar today. And Kamala, I was wondering what you would think about ending, everybody's saying their goodbyes, and then ending with that last video to see if, you know, those that have the audio, if they'd like to watch the last video, and then we'll just shut the stream down when it's done. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Does that sound good? Okay, was there anything else you wanted to say? You're good.
No, that just somebody had asked about the book, and the reconciliation steps that I was reading from was from this book. So you can order this online.
The Reconciliation Manifesto, excellent. Great. Okay, thank you again, Kamala, so much, and we'll connect shortly, but we will play the video, and then everyone, we will just walk the feed once the video is done.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Happy Friday.
Bye.
We've had had a strong, vibrant culture, a strong, vibrant community. We want a lot of people to know that the City of Vancouver didn't just start in 1886. The City of Vancouver always had people that have lived here since time immemorial. My name is Wade Grant. I am a counselor from the Musqueam Indian Band. I was born and raised in the Musqueam Nation. I'm 35 years old. I work with the Musqueam Indian Band. I have a wife and 2 children, and a very proud member of the Musqueam Nation. Our ancestors welcomed the first European settlers here, and we welcome people here. We want them to know that they're welcome in our territory, and we enjoy letting them know a little bit about who we are because we feel it's important for them to learn our history, because our history is now their history as well.
Our community has been very innovative in addressing our needs. My name is Susan Tatouche, Executive Director of the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Centre, co-chair of the Metro Vancouver Aboriginal Executive Council. The Friendship Centre has been in place for almost 60 years, and it's probably one of the oldest friendship centres across Canada. And the Friendship Centre provides a welcoming, an open door, and friendly services. Our role is providing a place for our urban Aboriginal people to maintain their culture. They're able to show the pride in their culture, in their tradition.
Only through dialogue, only through understanding, only through education can we really get past the misunderstandings that people have of First Nations people, and vice versa that First Nations have about people that are not from our communities.
And if you look at the word community, you'll find the word unity. And that's what is the core value of our community, is the unity that is there for everyone to be part of, to be recognized and acknowledged. And Vancouver has been very open to providing the opportunity for that exchange through their social planning department. And the fact that this year has been declared the Year of Reconciliation by the City of Vancouver is another opportunity to share the information about the Aboriginal experience in our history here in Vancouver.
I really hope that people take an opportunity to learn a little bit more about First Nations people, to learn about the history that they weren't able to get when they went to school, to learn about the history that they're not able to get because they have just arrived in Canada. It's incumbent upon them to learn about the entire past. Canada has many different histories and many different ways that it's been told. And it hasn't been told enough or listened to enough through the voices of First Nations, through the voices of the First Peoples of Canada. Our histories have been told by historians that aren't from our communities, and I think now is an important time in our history to get those stories out, and I hope that people are able to reach out and ask questions. And we want people to understand where we're coming from and why we are here and how long we've been here, and I think that's important.